Let's talk about the difference between your basic, non-alcoholic beer and the alcohol-free beer, Heineken 0.0. The big difference? Taste. Because here's the thing. If you've ever had a non-alcoholic beer, you know that it's just not the same. Each sip is basically just rubbing your face in the fact that you are not, in fact, drinking a beer. But Heineken 0.0 wants to lift you up, not tear you down. The brewers there have very kindly removed the alcohol, but kept the flavors. Now you can enjoy the taste of Heineken at work, at home, or in the middle of a heated discussion about the stock market. Alcohol-free for just 69 calories. So head out and grab your own pack of Heineken 0.0 today, or get it delivered right to you. Must be 21 plus to purchase. Please drink responsibly.
Well, we've arrived at the final episode of Business Casual for a little while, and I've had an absolute blast hosting the show these past few months. I hope you've enjoyed listening and learning alongside me. Along with a thank you for all your support, I just want to remind you one final time that our inbox is open. We really want your thoughts on how to improve the show while we're away. You can let us know by sending an email to businesscasual@morningbrew.com. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. What's up, everyone, and welcome back to Business Casual, the show where the masters of business share their thoughts on the biggest questions shaping our world. I'm Alex Lieberman, and for one final time, let's hop into it. When it came to thinking about the episode of the show we wanted to leave you with before our summer break, only one name really came to mind: Reid Hoffman. In many ways, Reid personifies the various dimensions of our show. Like many of our guests, he's a founder. He co-founded LinkedIn, no big deal. Like many of our other guests, Reid's also an investor. And to be honest, calling him just an investor is a little unfair. He's invested in some of the companies that are most central, most iconic to our lives and experiences today. He was an early investor in Facebook and Airbnb, just to name a few. He's also been an executive at PayPal, a board member at Microsoft, and even hosts his own podcast, aptly named Masters of Scale. In other words, Reid's experiences and knowledge touch so many of the different themes we discuss on this show. So I wanted to talk to him about his thoughts on scaling businesses, his time as a founder, his time growing PayPal, and so much more. Reid Hoffman, partner at Greylock, host of Masters of Scale, and man of many other titles, welcome to Business Casual.
It is an absolute pleasure.
So I need to start with, your oft-used phrase of blitzscaling. I've seen it everywhere. I've read about it in your blog posts. But there are a fair bit of Business Casual listeners who probably have never heard the term, but I think it's really important for them to understand. So let's set the foundation. How did you come about this concept of blitzscaling? Give some context before we go into it.
So actually, all three of the books that I've written, blitzscaling being the most recent, all came about from the world as I found it. And the world as I found it comes from Silicon Valley. Why is it that half of the NASDAQ comes from a area of the world that is in toto 3.5 million people? That's not tech people. That's everybody, right? Which the tech industry is a small thing. And why is it so many of the tech companies that have global throw weight and influence? And one of the things that in blitzscaling that I realized was that it's like the whole industry in Silicon Valley is focused on how do you build the modern, amazing tech company. And they experiment and they do lots of crazy things. But when they discover the really counterintuitive or new or different things, and then it spreads within the kind of the learning network that is the Valley and grows. And the reason why this is important is not just because we as the rest of the world say, okay, well, there's a bunch of interesting and important technology companies coming out of Silicon Valley, but also all industries and all companies are on path to becoming technology companies. And as technology companies, if this is the pattern by which technology companies of the future are built, it's the pattern by which all companies ultimately of the future are going to be built. And so how do I share that? And blitzscaling was the encapsulation. And one of the reasons why to create a word is because the important thing is to understand the concepts of it. To understand the fact that it's a new way of thinking. It's a mindset. It's a set of things that are, in fact, counterintuitive from what you might learn in business school.
How is it a different way of thinking? What was the old way of thinking? How is blitzscaling a new way of thinking? What does that look like?
So classically, when people say, hey, I'm an expert at business, I've learned it, that's, MBA programs around the world, you learn a set of kind of concepts like, okay, you have a market, a total addressable market, a means of doing customer acquisition, a kind of what is your operating margin? What is your lifetime value of a customer? And then all of that goes into being as efficient as possible. And as efficient is, well, you've got, a low customer cost of acquisition, you've got high customer retention, you've got good revenue, you've got good operating margins, and then that generates what the value of your business is. And that's essentially what is taught in Business 101, 201, 301, kind of around the world. Now, what blitzscaling is, the precise definition is prioritizing speed over efficiency. Remember, I was just talking about efficiency in an environment of uncertainty. And so classically, you think, well, what you actually do is prioritizing efficiency and you're prioritizing reducing uncertainty. But what happens is say, well, actually, in fact, there's a window by which the first company to scale is going to set the network, set the platform, set the standards, set the rules, be the global platform for the establishment of this kind of technology. And so speed matters much more than efficiency. And it's not just efficiency in capital, it's also efficiency in human capital, it's efficiency in even understanding maybe what your business model is, your customer acquisition costs, or any of these things. And so what you do is you say, well, no, we're prioritizing speed first to scale over the normal efficiency things that business people think about. And kind of classically, like if you go back to the first internet boom in the Valley, what happened is they got all these crazy people. They're building these companies before they knew what their business models are, and they're spending all this money and acquiring customers, right? And they're just out to lunch, and eventually, they'll get their just desserts, and then of course the internet winter happens, and they go, see, we were right. Well, what happens is you were right about some things, like, well, taking capital intensive models and having them be unprofitable and backing up the truck and spending tons and tons of capital in ones that don't evolve into a very good business. Yeah, that's a bad idea. And by the way, all of Silicon Valley learned it. On the other hand, saying, hey, we can establish a network before we actually even necessarily know the business model of the network, but then the risk adjustment is establishing the business on top of the network. That actually, in fact, can create amazing outcomes. And so we'll do those kinds of things. We will still do blitzscaling. And that's the kind of thing of, well, when do you play the blitzscaling game? What are the triggers for doing it? When do you do it? How do you do it? That's obviously, kind of, why I wrote the book, why, do the podcast, Masters of Scale. Like all of these things are understanding this new world.
When was the first time as an operator you experienced blitzscaling? Was it at LinkedIn? Was it at PayPal? Talk about your experience.
Well, the very first one is at PayPal. It was my kind of the second startup that I was involved in. I had been on the founding board of directors of PayPal, been sharing all of my experience with Max Levchin and Peter Thiel. And then when I was like, okay, I need to go start another company, they said, come join PayPal because, we're just launching. And by the way, in classic kind of blitzscaling thing, we don't have a business model. Yeah, when the venture capitalists invested in us, we described how we're going to be making money on the float from being a bank and deposits. But by the way, if you do the math, that's never going to work. Like literally when we were doing this blitzscaling, the business model was, well, in a payment system, people will be keeping deposits and we'll be making interest off the deposits. And yes, the interest rates were higher than they were today, but not a lot. Like when we did the math, he said, well, in order to make money on the deposits, the money would have to stay within the PayPal system for 2 years before it exited. Yeah. And this is a system where it's like the fastest payment where you could put the money in your pocket. So like we know from the very math that the business isn't going to work.
Right.
What's relevant is how do we get to scale really big? And when I joined, it was how do we get to a big scale and sell? And we were learning blitzscaling as we went along. We figured out how to prioritize speed of growth over efficiency, over a business model, over a number of things. And to give a bit of a tantalizer, we were growing and this is where people should be good at math, at 2 to 5% per day. And so the compounding rate of that growth is obviously astronomical.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Now, when you say that, well, what we had was a cost line and not a revenue line, you could understand that that would also lead to a certain amount of terror because, our cost line was growing at 2 to 5% per day and there was zero revenue line. So that was the kind of we're going for it, for the establishment of the network, for growing PayPal within eBay, on the belief that we can get to the other side, where the other side is either someone who has a really good business model, acquires us as a strategic asset, or we can build a business model. And obviously, if you see where PayPal is today, we got to the building the business model successfully.
So that makes a ton of sense. So how much was a really, I would say, aggressive competitive landscape factor of the need to blitzscale? How much was it just that PayPal operated or built its moat off of network effects, versus how much was it just like the kind of like the thought process that you guys wanted to shoot for the stars? Like, what was the biggest factor in deciding that blitzscaling, which I assume you didn't call it that at the time, made the most sense?
So it's fundamentally when you make the decision that it's worth a lot of capital and a lot of inefficiency to be the first to scale. That's the most kind of kernel, focal point, diamond edge of the decision. There's a number of things that could lead that. Now, generally speaking, one of the things is first to scale better be valuable, right? Because you go, well, we're first to scale in a business that has no margins, right? And that never creates a business. Well, unless someone buys you or something else, that's not valuable. Valuable is being a strategic asset to someone who has a good business or being a good business. So you have to have that kind of as a target, as an understanding. And by the way, generally speaking, in these strategies, it's good to not just have one target, but to have a flexible range of target depending on what plays out in the market and competition and so forth. And that's part of, kind of being good strategy. Next thing is, well, do you have to put in the afterburners, right? So frequently blitzscaling is driven by competition. Now, there was competition on the PayPal case. There were people who were copying us, one of which we merged with, X.com. But also it's like, for example, part of that was, well, we found we were growing on eBay, and eBay had a company called BillPoint, which is competition. And like, which of us got to the network first within eBay was the one that was going to have the ability to refine and develop a business model. Because frequently when the first to scale is not just the first to scale and the first of the number of customers, but you're also learning from the customers, learning what the actual market is, figuring out how to tune, like what is next year's feature set? What's next year's business model? What's next year's way of acquiring customers? And being there first and at scale really, really matters. And so all of that was part of the decisioning of that's what mattered. Scale is what mattered. And so we were completely oriented in being crazy in the way that the classic business community, the classic, captains of industry, MBAs and business school professors all thought, oh, these were young kids who had no idea what they were doing.
Totally. And I mean, it makes a lot of sense. You talked about it in the context of eBay and the idea of getting to the network first and being kind of like the payment solution of choice was really, really important. Even yesterday, I was reading the original first public shareholder letter from Amazon, 1997 letter. And, so much of the language in that from Jeff Bezos is about like their strategy isn't the right strategy for everyone, but where market dominance really is like, you are the winner or you are the loser. It was the same exact thing of like speed, velocity of capital, et cetera, was such an important thing. Talk about when does it not make sense to think in that way? What sort of businesses is blitzscaling maybe not the optimal decision to make?
Blitzscaling is a trigger and you only do it for a while. You don't do it forever.
Yep.
Right? The two most common triggers to say yes are, well, actually, in fact, it's game on and there's either extant intense competition or could be very easily intense competition, or we simply, because it's like a network property or a scale property, we need to get to scale very fast. And those are the two most common triggers. Now, then people say frequently, when do you stop blitzscaling? And the usual answer is, well, when someone couldn't take your market from you, take your business from you by blitzscaling, or at least blitzscaling along the path you're doing, that's when you start tuning towards efficiency. Like one of the mistakes is, oh, blitzscaling is the goal. It's like, no. This is the inefficient spend of capital. Like when you say, hey, I'm blitzscaling out there and I don't even know my business model, that's not something to be proud of. That's something that I know I have a major risk factor that I need to adjust, that I need to fix en route to creating an amazing, world transforming business. So just to, for everyone to understand it. Now, there's a lot of times when blitzscaling doesn't make sense to do. So for example, say you're out in a green field by yourself and you have time to test and experiment and so forth. Well, then you should be focused on efficiency and learning. You don't think competition is going to be coming at you in a high speed. You have a depth of a moat in a technical advantage. Like, well, we've been building this platform for 8 years, right? And to test our business, one would need to have this platform one way or the other. And so we're going to be, kind of working on efficiency off that because we have such a head start that even if someone were going to start being competitive with us, it would be much later. We have a privileged access to a market, a channel, a region, all of these things go, well, not blitzscaling.
So to that point, do you believe that the stage at which a company, it makes sense for them to blitzscale is the most challenging, highest risk stage in a business? When you think about the life cycle of a business, in terms of risk level and challenge, where would you stack this point at which you blitzscale?
There's nothing that's more risky. There may be other things that are kind of equivalently risky at different ways, so there are different kinds of risks. It's kind of shape risk is not all one sort. And the reason is because usually when you're blitzscaling, you're going way out over your skis. Usually it's succeed or blow up. There are a number of companies which have blitzscaled and are now, part of the graveyard of technology companies. And so there's a bunch of big risks on it. But by the way, startups are also risks. There's just also a lot of startup graveyards that never blitzscaled either. It's the question of a risk, taking smart risks for outcomes is the way of looking at this. And by the way, when you're doing it, it feels crazy and intense. One of the things that when kind of we were reflecting on those blitzscaling years of PayPal, and we were talking about what the learning curve looks like. And frequently when someone tells you learning experience, you say, oh, where are the scars? What kind of blood did you leave on the floor? And the answer is a lot. We said, well, we've never learned so much except for maybe between the ages of 2 and 3. Right? That's how intense the learning experience is. And it's super stressful because you might flip back and forth even in a 15-minute period between, we're going to succeed, this is going to be amazing, and, oh, we're going to die.
I want to stay on that point because over the last year, I can't remember when you wrote it, you wrote a post about the loneliness of entrepreneurship. And I actually think this is a really important point to call that out because not just loneliness, but I would say mental health of entrepreneurs, the level of stress, the risk of burnout. I would imagine it has to be incredibly intense during a point of blitzscaling. A lot of business casual listeners are either founding companies or about to found companies, and they're thinking about, okay, this sounds like it's going to be stressful as hell. How do I navigate this? Not physically, but emotionally. How do you think about that?
I think the most central thing is the people that you go to the field with, because life is a team sport, not an individual sport. And usually the whole entrepreneurship thing is that lone entrepreneur, that hero, the genius, visionary, innovator. Yes, these people can be amazing and can really have seen something that other people haven't seen and done all the work to create something from nothing that is kind of entrepreneurship. But the key thing is none of these scale things are accomplished by, individuals or by even kind of 2 to 3 person founding teams, or established by assembling a team around you, a network around you. And it's not just employees and executives, which are obviously important, but investors and advisors. And that kind of thing is extremely helpful. The reason I did the loneliness post, which I think was around in the winter sometime, was that I think a lot of entrepreneurs just go, well, that's the fact of it. You just have to weather it. You just have to be strong enough. You just have to have enough grit. And the answer is to say, no, actually, in fact, other people feel this too. And that part of what you do is reach out and connect with people. It's part of how you might select, some of your key investors or board members. It's certainly how you should select, some advisors. It certainly is how you should select co-founders. It's certainly how you should bring in some of your key executives, because the notion of we are a team, we are taking this default dead thing, because as you know, one of the quotations I use to focus people on entrepreneurship is you jump off a cliff and you assemble an airplane on the way down. It's the kind of oh my God, this is kind of scary and vertigo and distracting. Yep. And then you say, we do this together. And I think that's kind of the most fundamental in all of the advice you can give people about how to navigate the really psychologically stressful and difficult path this is.
Data privacy is a phrase that gets thrown around a lot in the internet news cycle, and it can seem like a big concept for corporations and governments to worry about. But if you use the internet on a daily basis, then you should be thinking about your data privacy every day too. The easiest way to secure your data online is with NordVPN, the intuitive VPN that makes your online data unreadable to others. Once you're connected to NordVPN, you're free to enjoy the internet in complete privacy. Phew. Never fear, listeners. NordVPN works on all popular platforms, and you can secure up to 6 devices with one single account, including your smart TV and router. Go to nordvpn.com/casual or use coupon code CASUAL at checkout to get a 2-year plan plus 1 additional month with a huge discount. They have a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you've got nothing to lose. That's nordvpn.com/casual and coupon code CASUAL.
So I want to switch gears for a second to Reed as the investor rather than Reed as the operator. And something I'm actually really curious about as, someone who's very early in kind of their career of angel investing, I've been starting to write early stage checks, is kind of having a self-awareness of like what creates joy in operating, what creates joy in like initial building, and what creates joy in investing. So I'd love to hear your perspective of when you think about all the different hats you've worn, what brings you joy in investing, and how is it similar or different from the joy you got while building LinkedIn or PayPal?
So the similar joy is kind of you're looking out at the entrepreneurship thing as building a new product or service that can fundamentally make a huge difference in the world. It might be something that customers delight in. It might make the functioning of society a lot healthier. It could be a broader base, or it could be more green or economical, or, any number of things. And the entrepreneurship is about the creation of that new. As an investor, it's these amazing entrepreneurs come to me with an interesting idea where they go, here is a way that the world could be so much better. And, one of the things is it doesn't just have to be an amazing, like if you have a good product, just, it could even be a new way of constructing sandwiches. That's like, wow, that's not climate change. Sure. But you're creating jobs and you're creating delight for customers and so forth. Like, it's a really important thing. So there's a whole range. It isn't just the, hey, it's SpaceX and we're revolutionizing space. It's a set of, I have this thing that we could build. And when we build it, not only are a whole bunch of individuals better off, but we are better off as an industry, as a society. And that the investor role is the, hey, I'm a helper. I'm an advisor. I'm a counselor. I'm a co-participant. And there is just amazing amounts of joy in that.
Totally. And so I need to call out an example for a second that I thought of when you were talking about this idea of like building a business doesn't mean just like from day one fundamentally changing the world. Just because you're not building rockets doesn't mean you're not doing something really positive for society. Among many of the essays I've read that you've written, one of them was about Airbnb. And I believe you wrote it right after the company IPO'd, and you talked about this experience of investing in the company. And I want to let you tell the story, but the gist that I feel is at least your first reaction to the business from information you gathered made it feel more like a sandwich company than a SpaceX. And so I'd be interested for you to just share your perspective of how your vision for what Airbnb could be changed over time and how that ultimately got you to invest.
Airbnb is actually one of the ones where I actually, in fact, understood the transformative characteristic from the very beginning. And the reason is that, like, if there is kind of a theme to my direct ideation and kind of world expertise and so forth, it's the network that redefines society. It's LinkedIn and PayPal, but Airbnb is another one of those, because the way that I looked at it is I said, well, actually, in fact, this is transformative. Because if you look at the host side, they go, well, what's the most important illiquid asset that hosts have? And the answer is my apartment rental or my house or my, and you say, well, I have a huge amount of illiquidity in that. And that illiquidity turned into liquidity could be something that's really key. It could be I'm paying my mortgage. It could be I'm supplementing my income and making my life work. And so the host goes, I now have a chance. And if you look at all of the work networks, because, the creation of work networks is one of the things obviously that I pay attention to and do a lot with. Airbnb has, when you look at like Uber and all the rest, has the highest earnings potential. And so that was on the host side. And then on the traveler side, the notion is, well, I'm a traveler and I'm going to some other place. Now, sometimes I go to another place because I want to sit on the river or the lake by myself and go fishing. But a lot of times, of course, I'm going to a place where I want to connect with the local community. I want to see what feeling like being in Paris is or Barcelona. And Airbnb, having that notion of belonging and connecting, was also transformative to people's understanding each other and culture. And
I was going to say, I think the thing that I was referring to is, I think the original kind of advice you had shared that you got was like, oh, it's going to be this thing where people just sleep on couches and they don't necessarily get the full apartment. And to me, it's like that small shift in thinking from like, oh, wow, you can actually have like a space that is native to the environment that you're going to stay is an amazing unlock for both sides of the market.
Yeah. And actually that particular point was the fact that someone had told me, oh, Airbnb is about couches, and couches I thought wasn't that interesting. So I met Airbnb 18 months later than I could have, because when the first time they were trying to reach me and someone else said it's about couches, I went, oh, couches is not that interesting because couches doesn't have that transformation for the host. Couches it may have some transformation for some travelers, but the couches is a very narrow set. Whereas once it's the marketplace for space, then it was like, oh.
Yeah, it could be huge. And this is a selfish question for me as now writing early stage checks is obviously when you're looking at companies that early, it is not a quantitative decision in terms of looking at the revenues of the business, trying to figure out what multiple makes sense to pay them. Like not just Airbnb, but as you're writing checks in general, what is your mental model for assessing early stage companies?
So typically as investors, the kind of classic trifecta is you look at market, you look at the idea and the plan, and you look at the entrepreneur. And one mistake that investors make is that they blend the score between the all three. And really what you want is you want one of them very, very clearly above the bar. Obviously, you'd prefer to have all three clearly above the bar. If you have all three clearly above the bar, more or less back up the truck. That's a pretty rare circumstance. You're like, I want every available share that's available right now because all three. Usually what you're doing is saying, well, this one's really good, right? And these other two maybe, at least they're not like, they're not catastrophes. They're not errors. They're not things that are going to break, because any of these three can break the business. And then when you get to the early stage, here's how that combination comes together. So one is you overweight the entrepreneur, right? The 1 to 3 people who are that, because the pivoting and the changing and the evolution and sticking with it and that sort of thing in the early stages, almost always, like PayPal's first idea was encryption on mobile phones that would be a platform that people would buy the encryption platform, right? So, this is completely gone.
Oh yeah, wildly different.
So, and that's kind of the people side of it. Now, the next thing is to say, okay, now there's a huge amount of risks, and you should write down all the risks. And you say, if the risks play out, like we can solve them a little or a lot, what's the outcome? Is the outcome amazing? Is the outcome worth all the risks? And when you're doing this, and part of the reason you start with a risk side of it, so you've looked at what the projected market is, what the plan is, what the entrepreneurs say, okay, here are all the risks. If they navigate these risks, is it transformative? Is it sufficiently big to be really worth it? Now, if you say, hey, the risks are much more discrete, then the outcome doesn't have to be as large. The kind of investing I tend to do, like I'm very comfortable with the oops, didn't work at all, right? Like, you lost all your marbles, play again.
Yep.
And other people are much less comfortable with that. I tend to be the, play for the world changing kinds of outcomes. Yeah. And so, but then you kind of look at that analysis of the risks and you say, okay, what's the plan? Like if you look through an Airbnb, you say, will people get around this kind of cultural thing of the weirdness of renting from someone else? Will cities realize this is a good thing for them versus a bad thing for them? Will you get to the higher level of security that you can get by tracking network participants that gives you kind of equivalent or better security that you can get from what you do with hotels and other kinds of things? And so does all of that, kind of play into it? And can you play through these risks? And I looked through them and I said, yes, I think there's a really good chance at these. And even if you only did somewhat, you'll be pretty good. And so that was part of also looking at these early stage investments.
That makes sense. So it's like something with Airbnb, say, a big thing around Airbnb around the rest is like government regulation. It's something you considered at the time, but your view was like, even if government regulation is a possibility, it is a risk I'm willing to stomach, that even if it does pose a risk, I still think it can be really big.
Yes, exactly. And like, for example, you look at that specific one, you say, well, really that's going to be city by city. So maybe you're going to have a problem city or two or three. And, paradoxically, one of the Airbnb city challenges is San Francisco, which is, it's like your hometown.
So ironic. Yep.
Yes, exactly. And you say, look, so it's city by city. So all you need is some cities to see the future and realizing that this is good for the city, that it brings in economics, that it distributes those economics around the citizenry, that creates a much more robust network and base to have it. And so you have some. And then, by the way, when you have some, you can prove it. And then eventually the other cities come around because they begin to realize, maybe some of them very slowly. And so it wasn't a all or nothing. It wasn't one regulator in one office. What's the grumbling of their stomachs or their worry about how this plays out? And that was part of the analysis of this is okay. Like even if a couple of important cities go the wrong direction, this will still work out.
Are you in marketing, sales, or customer success? Okay then. If you just answered yes to that question out loud, not only is that hilarious, but we've got an event you're going to want to block your calendar for. Inbound 2021 is hosted with love by HubSpot and takes place October 12th through the 14th. And yes, you can wear sweatpants. This digital event will host over 70,000 forward-thinking global professionals and thought leaders who are coming together to learn, connect, and drive the future of how the world does business. Grab a free starter pass or level up and purchase a Powerhouse Pass for all access. Head to inbound.com/register and be there October 12th to 14th. Trust us on this one. Hey listeners, let's see a show of hands of everyone who's been burned on exchange rates at some point in their lives, right? That's like everybody. When you exchange money around the world, that exchange rate you typically see is pretty inflated. In other words, you're getting dinged by big banks who add a spread on top of the real exchange rate. It's kind of infuriating, right? So let me tell you about Wise. Wise always gives you the real rate, so you or your business can send, spend, and receive money internationally without any of the nasty fillers. You only pay a low, transparent conversion fee, and that saves you money. Over 10 million people and businesses are already on board. See what fairness in international finance feels like. Try Wise for free at wise.com/business. That's wise.com/business.
So one last topic I want to talk about with you, and it very much hits close to home. It's the idea of people's perception of what it means to be a CEO, and specifically what it means to kind of be in it for the long run. And what I mean by that is I think when people envision entrepreneurship, they envision the founder, CEO who stays CEO forever. People's mind is the Zucks of the world, the Bezoses until recently. And I think a really interesting thought experiment and just reality for people to realize is that is just one way of doing things. So recently I moved from the CEO role to executive chairman at Morning Brew 3 months ago after 6 years in the role. I know you were at LinkedIn for, I believe, 7 or 8 years before passing the torch to a gentleman who then passed it to Jeff Weiner. How do you think about the progression of a CEO and when it is time to pass the torch versus the time to actually push yourself to evolve?
So there's at least two fundamental factors. One is the analysis of the business and where the business is. And as a founder, your economics, your glory, your identity is all wrapped up in the business succeeding. So like if you turn to janitor and the company turns into this amazing thing, you're still oh my God, you helped create this amazing thing. So you should step a little bit aside of the ego, because there's a lot of ego things around the CEO, I'm in charge, and business press and everyone else always wants to talk to the CEO. And you say, no, it's about what do you create? And so part of that is having a good map of what your strengths and skills and your disposition and your commitment and what are the things you need to be doing. When I was looking at it for myself, I said, well, the thing that I'm really excited about is product and business strategy. It's roughly, what do you wake up on Saturday morning thinking about? And I wake up on Saturday morning thinking about that, which makes me a very good investor and board member. So it makes me a very good CEO of a 100-person employee company. But when you begin to get to the thousands of people, what you really want to be waking up on Saturday morning is, how am I maximizing the organization, right? Now, of course, you still have to have strategy and you still have to do these other things, but that's the thing of how to do that better is the thing I'm thinking about on Saturday morning. And so I said, okay, that's not me in the future. I could try to develop it, but normally my advice to people is, don't work on your weaknesses, work to put yourself in a position where your strengths apply, and then reconfigure your organization so you have a teamwork where everyone's strengths are applying. And so, for example, when Jeff and I decided to launch China, it's like, well, that's a startup thing. I will do the China side for LinkedIn, and Jeff will continue to scale the rest of the world. And I'll be working for Jeff while I'm doing the China side because, I'm the startup person, but with the deep trust, it's like he understands when I'm saying, look, we're going to do this like thing that has nothing to do with the scale efficiency that you're one of the masters in the world at, because that's what the startup game looks like. He goes, okay, I trust you. You know that. You go do it. Let me know how it plays out. And then the second one is the kind of question around, what is the path that you're going down? So part of the answer, the second part of the question of like when you should develop your own skills, is you said, look, the really important thing to me is I continue to be the CEO of this organization, and I believe I can build the skills that are essential for its current place. And that's what's important to me. Then you might decide to build the skills. Like it comes down to that kind of personal decision of kind of mission. Now, you still have to evaluate the needs of the business first. And you say, look, I can't develop the skills. I should still trade it out. But, frequently, for example, there's a bunch of things that you can learn about building culture and about building scale management. Like, for example, when I was making the decision to hire a CEO, most of my board members were saying, well, you should really think about hiring a COO. You should think about hiring what the phrase in Silicon Valley then was, your Sheryl Sandberg. You should do it that way. And I was like, no, actually, I want someone who owns the ball in the way a CEO does, who goes, it is my chance to be the quarterback and to make this, successful in the next phase of the game. And I own it. I'm not the employee, I'm the owner. And I wanted to have that. And actually, one of the things that had helped me is because I'd had a lot of experience being on boards and investors and working with entrepreneurs. It's like someone I'm going to partner with, not someone who I manage.
Absolutely. And I think a point you made in the piece you wrote about, Bezos deciding to step back is this idea of creating a very clear distinction whenever you make this change of like, if you are stepping away from the role, giving the person oxygen to not only feel ownership, but where the company acknowledges and respects that ownership, because it can deprive the person you put in charge of actually not just feeling in charge, but also being respected as the one in charge.
Yep. And it's critical to you that they're successful. Like, as you know, when you're doing this kind of transition, it's the 1, 2, and 3 is how do you make this new team configuration, this new, team captain successful, because the other side is really painful and brutal.
Reed, it has been so cool to hear your unique perspective. You've seen the inside of businesses as an operator. You've seen the outside of businesses as an investor. You've worked early stage and you've worked late stage. So to hear you talk about everything from blitz scaling to culture to evolution as a CEO has been an absolute masterclass in business. I know I can speak for all of our listeners where it's been an absolute joy to hear all of your insights. Really appreciate your time.
It's a pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
Business Casual is produced and engineered by Daniel Marcus. Our researcher is Bella Hutchins. Our newsletter is written by Hannah Doyle. Alan Haberchak is our executive producer, and I'm your host, Alex Lieberman. If you like the show, make sure to rate and review us in your podcast app. It really helps people find the show. You can also connect with us on Twitter at BizCasualPod. That's at BizCasualPod. And we want to hear from you. Who do you want us to talk to on the show? Drop us a note. Our email is businesscasual@morningbrew.com.